And hello again. I'm Brian Keene. Welcome back to Secret Histories, a series of amateur videos shot here in my office where we go through each and every book I've ever had published in chronological order. And I talk a bit about their creation and their place in my career. And as promised, today we get to the one that many of you have been waiting for, and that is The Rising. But we don't start with this edition. We start with the actual first edition. How many of you thought this was the first edition of The Rising? Well, you were wrong. We start with this edition right here, Delirium Books, hardcover, published in 2003. Now, I started work on The Rising as far back as 1995. Back then, it was actually called Cabin Fever. In the late 90s, I basically started it over from scratch. As I'm sure most of my readers know, but maybe new readers don't, I've been married and divorced. Well, I've been married 3 times. I've been divorced 2 times. I have a son with each of those mothers. I get along well with each of those mothers. It's not acrimonious. The second divorce was never acrimonious. The first one was for several years, but not anymore. But anyway, my oldest son at the time was living with his mother in New Jersey. And I was traveling up to visit from Pennsylvania, and there was a blizzard. There was a snow emergency, and they did like a state of emergency, closed the highways down, etc. Well, these National Guardsmen stopped me, and they're like, "Sir, you gotta get off the next exit, state of emergency." And I'm like, "Oh, I sure will." And after they had disappeared over the horizon, I kept fucking going, and I thought, well, a bunch of armed forces with rifles and such won't stop me from seeing my son. What would? Zombies? No, but that would be a really cool idea. So I started revamping Cabin Fever. It became a novel called More Than Infinity. Richard Lehman very graciously, I guess it was in 99 or 2000, offered to read the first 3 chapters and give me some pointers. And he did. And unfortunately, I no longer have that manuscript that he had marked up, but I do have his letter. And, I do have his encouragement. And he said in the letter, he said, I'm going to give you a cover blurb for when this is eventually published, because I do think it will be eventually published. And sure enough, there is that cover blurb. Now, Dick died before this edition came out, so a lot of people were like, how the hell did he blurb the book? Well, that's how he blurbed the book. If you've gone through our previous installments of Secret Histories, then you've seen No Rest for the Wicked, you've seen Talking Smack, you've seen 4x4. Well, it was at that stage in my career, Dick was still alive. This would have been 2000, I suppose. We were at a party at a horror convention. And at the time, there was this young guy named Don Daria who was building a mass market paperback horror line at Leisure Books. Now, this is important because up until that point, for about a decade, there had been no mass market horror. It had died off, what people refer to as the 90s crash. The collapse of Zebra Books, the collapse of Del Abyss, etc. That's been written about extensively elsewhere. I've written about it. Grady Hendrix talks about it in Paperbacks from Hell, etc. Don Daria was hoping to build a stable of writers at Leisure and bring horror back into the mainstream. And he did. One of the first writers he reached out to was Richard Lehman, who previously had been one of the big four in horror fiction. You know, if you consider, some people say big five, but if you consider Stephen King, Dean Koontz, Anne Rice, Clive Barker, Richard Lehman, those were always the top sellers. The the problem with that is Lehman did not sell here in the U.S. His books sold like that overseas. In England and Australia, for example, he would often outsell Dean Koontz and Stephen King. But here in the States, couldn't get in print because of the horror crash. So Leisure was going to bring back horror, mainstream horror, make it available again at grocery stores, supermarkets, bookstores, etc. And Dick Lehman introduced me to Don and said, you know, this young writer, he's up and comer. You know, I really think you should check his stuff out. And Don said, what are you working on? And I said, I'm working on a zombie novel called More Than Infinity. And Don said, zombies? Nobody's done anything with zombies for a long time, not since, sorry, they want a motorcycle. He said, nobody's done anything since, you know, Skip Inspector's Book of the Dead, Phil Nutman's Wet Work. And I said, I know. That's why I want to do one. So Don asked me to send him the manuscript. And I did. And he bought it. And at another convention, he brought me the contract. At this point, Dick Lehman had passed. But I remember I had the contract, and I walked into the hotel bar, and Jack Ketchum, whose real name was Dallas Mayer, Jack Ketchum was sitting there at the bar. Now, a lot of Jack Ketchum fans don't know this, but before he became one of your favorite writers, he was an agent. He was a literary agent for Philip K. Dick. He was a literary agent for Henry Miller, you know, Tropic of Capricorn, Tropic of Cancer. Dallas knew his shit. And I'll never forget, Dallas says to me, you know, because I'm looking shell-shocked. I've got this contract for The Rising. And he says, what do you got there, kid? I said, I have a contract for The Rising. And he says, do you have an agent? I said, no, I don't have an agent. I don't know how to get an agent. He said, buy me a bottle of bourbon and find a red pen, and I'll be your agent. So I did. I managed to convince the bartender. Hello, Bubbles. Making another guest appearance. Managed to convince the bartender, Miss Bubbles, to get me a bottle of, it was either Maker's Mark or Dewar's, I can't remember which, and so sell me the whole bottle, which they're not supposed to do. And Dallas and I sat there and we split that bottle, and I found a pen, and he negotiated my contract. And he said, if you follow this, you'll never need to have an agent. And sure enough, he was right. 50 plus books later, I have rarely used a literary agent. So that was how all this came about. Before that Leisure Books edition came out, however, one of the things I had was the rights to do a signed limited edition. So I sold it to Delirium Books. This edition came out in 2003. This is, in fact, the first edition. So, you know, when people are selling these online, you want to look for this in the first edition. The special signed hardcover edition is limited to 300 copies. This sold out immediately. At the time, it was Delirium Books' fastest seller. I don't know what it goes for on the secondary market these days. There were points in my career where this edition would go for $250, $300. I don't know what it goes for now, because there have been so many editions of The Rising published since then. In addition to this, Delirium did two other editions. They did this lettered edition, leather bound in the box. Looks like this. And that was limited to 26 copies. Delirium Books 2003. There was also what they call an Ultra edition. The Ultra edition was oversized. It was about twice the size of this. and it was limited to 6 copies total. I owned an Ultra Edition until my second divorce back in 2010, 2011, at which point I desperately needed money, and I sold that Ultra Edition. I got a lot of money for it. When I see Ultra Editions now, they go for a ridiculous amount of money. Out of my price range, for sure. I'm hoping that one of my dear fans, when they pass, will leave in their will, give this Ultra Edition to Brian Keene, but that hasn't happened yet. But then, of course, the Leisure Books edition came out. Now, an easy way to tell if it's a first printing with Leisure Books. If you do this, you see my name there, or the title here, if they are slightly raised under your fingertips, if you can feel them, that is a first edition. If they are flat, it's a reprint. With Leisure's collapse a decade later, we lost a lot of records, but to the best of my knowledge, the Rising went through 11 or 12 printings while it was at Leisure Books. This first edition, they did a printing of 10,000 copies. And as it came out in 2004, and as the Delirium edition, those 300 copies had been out for a year before that, there was so much buzz about this book. It had been in Fangoria, it had been in Rue Morgue. People were aghast that they couldn't find copies because those 300 copies were sold out. So when this hit bookstores, when it hit the grocery store racks, etc., it sold out immediately. That was not something that I expected, and it was not something that Leisure Books expected. So they immediately had to go to a second printing, which also sold very fast. And the rest, as they say, is history. It was my first time on the bestseller list. My first published novel was a big hit. We've talked elsewhere about how this novel and a movie called 28 Days Later and a comic book called The Walking Dead all came out very, very close to each other. And every one of them dealt with a parent-child dynamic, and every one of them featured a protagonist who was a woman of color, very capable, who had agency. And every one of them featured all these similar themes, almost as if we had talked to each other, almost as if we had ripped each other off. That's not true. None of us knew each other at the time. The great writer Alan Moore, one of my favorite writers, he talks about writing as an act of actual magic. And he proposes this creative dimension, this realm called idea space that artists tap into, and that's why you see similar things with similar themes come about at certain times in human civilization as far as our art goes. I believe that The Rising and 28 Days Later and The Walking Dead are a part of that. I believe that myself and Robert Kirkman and Danny Boyle tapped into idea space at the time. But my gosh, look at what we did in doing that. Suddenly, zombies were everywhere. Now, zombies had been around as long as I'd been a kid, thanks to, George Romero, thanks to Richard Matheson. But it is not arrogance, and it is not tooting my own horn to talk about how after the publication of this book and that movie and that comic book, zombies were more popular than they had ever been at any time in pop culture. Enough so that, when I started seeing my book ripped off, in fact, I remember one filmmaker made a zombie movie called The Rising, actually filmed the fucking thing. Somebody sent me an early screener of it, and I got lawyers involved, and we got it shut down, and I don't know whatever happened to that guy, but his movie never got released. I remember walking into Hot Topic about 3 years after the book had been published. They had a line of t-shirts: zombie goldfish, zombie deer, zombie squirrel. We all know where that came from, but that's a little harder to sue over. Uh, this book, this stupid fucking novel whose idea I got one day in a snowstorm, went on to influence pop culture in such a way. It is not my favorite of my novels. In fact, it's one of my least favorite of my novels. The writing is rough. I was a writer who had not quite yet found his voice. I think it reads more like Dick Lehman, Ed Lee, Rex Miller than it does Brian Keene. But it put me on the map, and everything that has happened in my career since I owe to the success of this book and to the readers who made it a success. As I have told my sons and as I have told my stepdaughter, will they ever be wealthy? Probably not. Not from their old man's output. They will never have the money that the children of famous household brand authors have. But thanks to the Rising, for the rest of their lives, they will never ever have a month where they have to worry about paying the electric bill. Now, that may not sound like much to some of you, but as somebody who grew up lower middle class, blue collar, and who has at times in his life struggled to pay the fucking electric bill, that's a big deal. The Rising has never gone out of print, other than when Leisure collapsed. And even then, it was in print overseas. So it's really never gone out of print since 2004. And here we are in 2025. It continues to sell every month. I still get a check for the Rising. When I am gone every month, my children will still get a check for the Rising. That's a big deal to me. What I'd like to do is go through some of the other editions. This is Science Fiction Book Club edition of The Rising. It's an exact replica of the Leisure edition, except that it is a hardcover. When I got the rights back years later, we did the author's preferred version. I got Alan Clark's permission to use the cover art to that original 2003 edition. This was Deadite Press's edition. These came out in, 2013. This edition came out. Thunderstorm Books also did a hardcover to commemorate that 10th anniversary edition. I have always loved this cover. Now, that is not how I pictured Jim in the books at all, but I do love this cover. I know there's a glare from the lights, but I always love that. I can't remember who did this cover, so let's... M. Wayne Miller, that was who did. I thought it was Wayne, but I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to misquote. That's one of my favorite book covers of my own stuff. Lots and lots and lots of foreign editions. I'm not going to pull out all the foreign editions and show you because it will get repetitive. But some of the cool ones. This is the German mass market paperback. Where they said, I'm the new Richard Lehman. This is a Polish edition. The Rising in Polish is Knock Zombie. This is the Spanish edition. As you can see, a lot of these just used the Leisure cover. But then there were others, like Italy, that did this cover. And this is the text of this is actually the author's preferred edition from the 10th anniversary. I love that cover. Uh, Russian cover. Uh, Back when we still got along with Russia. So lots of different editions. And as I said, it remains in print from 2004 until now, 2025. It remains in print. Um, it will never be my favorite of my books, but I understand why so many of my readers, why it's their favorite. And I cannot thank you enough for that, for this book's success. That is because of you, my readers. Um, my very first published novel, you folks made me a hit. You made me a bestseller. And everything that I was able to achieve and everything that I've done since then all stems because of the success of this book. And I have you to thank for that. So thank you. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to say about The Rising. Yes, let's talk about that ending. I never intended for there to be a sequel to The Rising. I was building my own Labyrinth mythos at that point. In fact, if you read through these original editions, you'll see some stuff that begins building here and comes to fruition within the Labyrinth series, the first 3 books of the Labyrinth series. So I was building my shared universe as far back as 2003 when these came out, but I did not intend to write a sequel to this book. That ending was that ending. Lady or the Tiger. My interpretation of that ending was that Jim went inside the house. Danny was a zombie. He shot Danny, and then he shot himself. Fade to black as Martin and Frankie rush inside. Given the book's success and given the fierce reaction online and in newspapers, etc., to that ending, Don Daria at Leisure and Shane Staley at Delirium Books both convinced me to write a sequel. And I figured out how to do it. And that was, of course, City of the Dead, which we'll talk about next time. It occurs to me that I should show you some newspaper articles and stuff from this era, like the New York Times and Fangoria and stuff like that. But I believe I have talked about that elsewhere in other videos. So I'll take a look here at Patreon and YouTube afterward. And if I haven't, then I'll do another video focusing on those. Because I have them all, here in my archives. Some of them I've even got framed and hanging up on the wall. But I'm starting to ramble. I don't want to do that. But thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting not only this first novel, but the 50 plus books that have come since then. Next time we will get into City of the Dead. I appreciate you. I hope your 2025 is off to a good start, and we'll see you soon. Bye.